one of our show favorites, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, to go through some of the biggest news stories. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Help me understand this. Tulsi Gabbard, she's up for Trump's Director of National Intelligence. Senator Adam Schiff of California delayed her confirmation hearing. Now I'm reading that her vote might be done in a skiff and the results kept from the public. Why, in your estimation, is she seen as a danger in the eyes of Democrats and rhinos? And why make her vote secret, but none of the others secret?
Well, that's a good question. And I can only speculate because I'm not privileged to the rationale for this skiff discussion. You know that Tulsi is an outspoken critic of the Democratic Party. Obviously, that has not endeared her to the Democrats. So she has to assume that they will universally reject her no matter what she says or whatever she's done. Then when it comes to the Israel lobby, she's got a problem. Even though she has tried to bend the knee to Israel and reassure them that she's pro-Israeli, that's not enough because she made this horrible, horrible mistake of meeting with Assad years ago because she felt strongly that we should talk to people, even to people with whom we don't necessarily agree. Well, gosh, I agree. I think she's right. But, this is what it's like dealing with the lobby. Anyone who suggests that we do anything or talk to anyone that the lobby doesn't like is immediately castigated, attacked, criticized as an anti-Semite and so forth. So I assume that must have something to do with it. Otherwise, I can't think of any reason. The thing that I like most about Tulsi Gabbard is that, frankly, I see her as a truth teller. And when you look at the people that are passing easily with a voice vote in the Senate, those are the last people I would want to point into any administration. The people that seem to be quote unquote contentious or controversial seem to be exactly the sort of people we need in many cases. But that's my opinion.
Okay. Do you believe, I'm reading online, RFK Jr. has the votes, but then I'm also reading Mitch McConnell, others, especially Republicans tied in with Big Pharma, plan to oppose him. Do you think he has any shot of getting in? And if not, can Trump still use him in some capacity?
Keep in mind that President Trump can always make recess appointments. Now, what has to happen is that he contacts Speaker Johnson and essentially asks him to recess the House. If the House goes into recess, then the president has the authority to dismiss the Senate and put them in recess. That's the way the law is written. Now, if that happens, then he can appoint anybody he wants, and that person is guaranteed 12 months in that position. After 12 months, they have to return to the Hill in order to be confirmed by the Senate. Now, anybody who knows anything about politics in Washington knows that perhaps the most important actions that are taken or are not taken happen during the first 6 to 12 months of a presidency. So he may decide that if any of these people are rejected, to give them a recess appointment in order to get things done. Now, keep in mind the bureaucracy is loaded with people who are opposed to any change, just as most of the people on the Hill are opposed to any change. And the interesting thing is, when you look at someone like Hegseth, obviously not qualified to be Secretary of Defense or almost anything else I can think of in government, nevertheless, he passes. And I think for the most part, because there's an underlying assumption that he's not going to interrupt the money flow. There will be no drastic changes that will cause programs of record to be canceled, weapon systems to be canceled or dropped. And that's what's most important to people on the Hill. What they care about is what makes them money, what enriches them, and what sustains them in office. And that is the money that they appropriate to defense. So unless that changes radically, he's probably going to be fine. And that's why he was passed. But RFK Jr. is a different case entirely. He's on the side of those of us who have looked not only at the quality of our food and environment and the health implications, but also looked at the vaccine matter and has numerous questions. And there's a lot of data now that we did not have a couple of years ago that's very frightening. But if you're in the pharmaceutical business and you make money as a result of this, how welcoming are you going to be to RFK Jr.? I think it's pretty obvious. So this sort of exposes the fraudulent nature of the whole business.
Yeah, I read two things in the last 48 hours. Bill Gates has been privately funding a campaign to discredit RFK Jr. Also, this fake list of like 17,000 doctors that oppose him. I guess a lot of the names on there were not actually involved. And then there's a conservative think tank that's also going around Congress saying this guy is a wacko and has all these wild theories. I say let him get in there and debunk it. If it's true, then we need it cleared out. And if it's not, then you can put that baby to bed. But I do see him as one of the bigger threats, only because there's so much money from big pharma and big food. Those are my worries about him being confirmed.
No, I think you're 100% right. I would go one step further, though, and suggest that RFK Jr. poses a serious threat to the status quo because he is attractive to people who are Democrats as well as Republicans. He's the first evidence of a candidate in a long time who has exposed the uniparty. Because when you look at most of the policy issues and the things that you and I are discussing, this is not a function of Democrats or Republicans. You know, Rubio passed, he was on a voice vote, right? And virtually no opposition. Well, he's a card-carrying member of the uniparty. No change. We want constant hostility with Russia, constant hostility with everybody in the Middle East, except Israel, obviously. Constant hostility with China. You know, war, hostility. That's the name of the game that feeds the coffers full of cash. In other words, it makes people rich. They benefit from this, and they think they can control, you know, the consequences or the implications. They can't. So, you know, this is a sad day in the history of our country, but we need to come to terms with it and understand that anybody who is wildly popular on the Hill is probably poison.
Yeah, good point. Okay, I was asked to ask you this. I don't know whether you will have an answer or not, but it was determined between the election and the inauguration that Biden and his administration were sending $40 million a week in cash to the Taliban. Any idea why they might have been? Is it to buy off their? I don't know. Do you have any knowledge of that?
No, but that's not because it can't be true. That's just an area I haven't looked at very carefully. And we know that a lot of money has disappeared into Afghanistan since we left. And a lot of us have questioned why and what's the purpose. That needs to be answered. I'm just not somebody with the evidence or the information to answer it.
Okay. President Trump is using the military on the ground at the southern border. This is something you and I discussed several times. You seem to be in favor of that. Does he have enough people there? Does he need to go further? Will the military be used to round up illegals and ship them out? Or will ICE and DHS and local authorities be able to handle the deportation operation?
The answer to the first question is no. It's a drop in the bucket. It's almost irrelevant. Secondly, historically, when it comes to organizing mass deportation of illegals, that's being handled by the Army. And an Army general has been in command of it and has been given the authorities and the support from the federal and state levels to do the job. I don't see anything like that happening right now. And I like Tom Homan. I think he's a good man. I don't know what kinds of authorities and money he has. He seems to be directing things. Now, Kristi Noem seems to have passed almost unnoticed into the Department of Homeland Security, which reaffirms my conviction that we don't need the Department of Homeland Security. It's a huge waste of money and a money pit. We ought to get rid of it. But I don't see any serious, well thought out campaign designed to do two things: number one, first and foremost, immediately secure the southern border. Not just the southern border. We need to do better on the northern borders and the littoral waters. You know, we have a Coast Guard that appears to be sailing around the South China Sea and in the Persian Gulf. Last time I looked, the United States Coast Guard was designed to guard our coasts. So why not bring them back to do that job? The first mission of the United States Army is continental defense. Why isn't the Army defending it? In other words, if we were serious, I'd have marched the new Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff into my office and said, gentlemen, you have a mission. Mission is secure the United States of America, the continent. Now, your priority is number one, the southern border. And second priority is the northern border. And you're to work closely with the United States Coast Guard. And I would tell the Navy to get off its rear end and commit to the Coast Guard whatever is necessary for them to be successful in the prosecution of their mission. And then I would say, I want the name of a 2 or 3 star that you have great confidence and trust in, who's going to take over this mission, that will be able to report routinely to us what the status is on the border. And he's the one that I expect to organize the deportations and the security apparatus. You know, it's kind of funny, the first transcontinental phone call, and I guess transcontinental is the right word. It was a phone call made from the Waldorf Astoria, as I recollect, in New York City to El Paso, Texas. And the phone call was made to Brigadier General John Pershing, who at the time was the commander of the border and all of the forces on the border. And you can hear it. There's a recording of it. It's rather comical. You know, the senator so-and-so talking to some other rich Republican donor says, well, there, General, what's happening tonight on the Mexican border? And he says, well, sir, the Mexican border is calm. So we've done this sort of thing before. We need to do it again. If you're going to be serious about this, then get it done. But sending out 1,500 and then say, I'm going to send 10,000, what are they going to do? Who's really in charge? Forget it. You have to have a clear chain of command that goes from the top to the bottom. And I think it's time for the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army to accept responsibility for border security. Period. And I'd put the Border Patrol under them. And until that border is secure, it should be under military control. At some point when it's secure, the military can turn it back over to the border. But I would have the Border Patrol in support of the military, not the other way around. Now, are we serious about this, or is this another glitz and glamour marketing campaign?
Okay. From your perspective, it's not a lack of bodies. There's enough active duty military in the country, reserves, people that could be called home from Europe. Right now, it's about authority and a specific mission plan.
First of all, I don't know what the true status of our forces is. You know, the Marines are also largely, not exclusively, but largely a ground force. I'm told they've been deployed to a portion of the border. That's fine. I would treat the Marine Corps as part of the larger ground force. There's certainly enough troops in the United States Army to do this and equipment. I don't think that's an issue. So I don't know what's going on, to be frank with you. And everything starts at the top and works its way down in the military. So if you see dribbles and drabs of people moving in and coming in and going, that suggests that there's a lack of focus. It suggests to me that there isn't a clear mission statement. You know, what are we doing? What is the purpose? Who's providing what? What methods are we using? And what do we want this to look like when we're through? All those questions need to be answered up front. What I see is Tom Homan comes on and says, look, we picked up, all these criminals and we're deporting them. Okay, that's fine. How do you know they're not going to get back in? Well, have you secured the border? I don't know. I'm unhappy, frankly, as an American. First, you secure the border. Then you go after people. But then you got to distinguish the criminals from people who have doubtlessly broken our law by entering the country illegally. But they're not in the same category as convicted felons and rapists, murderers, thieves, and so forth. So why not have a grace period? Under the administration for the first 120 days, if you are here illegally and you volunteer to leave, then you can take everything you have with you. In other words, whatever you've made here, you can take it with you. If you register with us on the way out, we will actually consider you for readmission in the future when we decide that we can take more immigration. That's the first thing. Then after that 120-day period, it's over. We get you. You're going to feel the full weight of the law fall down on you. We're going to deal harshly with you. Make that very clear. Now, when you're doing this, understand if you do this well, the drug cartels are going to be screaming bloody murder because they won't be able to ship the drugs into the country and make the money that they've been making. So you're going to end up in a war inside the United States with the drug cartels. And if you're not already secure on that border with military power, you're going to be at war with them on the border. And by the way, there was a report today of drug cartel elements firing on U.S. forces on the border. Gosh, what a shock. Let's wake up and get this done the right way. And again, this is why I get frustrated, because we have a president who has many good ideas. He wants to do too much at once. You got to make some hard choices. You cannot do everything at once. You got about 6 to 12 months. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you want to accomplish? And by the way, nothing happening in Ukraine or the Middle East is more important than what is happening here inside our country. I strongly believe that. So I would disengage from whatever we're doing overseas. Get immediately out of Ukraine. That's over. That war is done. Stop aiding it. Get out. People say, well, we can't just leave. Really? That's what we did after 10 years in Vietnam. We do this repeatedly. We go in, we make a mess of it, and then we leave. Well, this time we just need to leave. There are no Russian armies poised to invade anybody in Western Europe. Nobody in their right mind in the Kremlin wants to rule Western Europe. What a mess. Forget it. So the point is, let's get straight what's most important. That border, the immigration issue, illegal, the restoration of the rule of law, suppressing, stopping the criminality. Those things are all at the top. And they should come first before anything else.
Okay. In a previous conversation I had with Scott Ritter, and maybe his opinion has changed, but he was against the U.S. military being on the border. He told me, Stephen, these are trained killers. That would be very bad. But isn't part of peace through strength deterrence? And having an armed military on the border, especially with the cartel now firing into the United States, wouldn't that be a great first step in deterrence?
Well, Scott's entitled to his opinion, and I certainly respect many of the things he has to say about the war in Ukraine, and also some of his observations about the Middle East. On this, I part ways completely. I think he's absolutely wrong. The United States Army was on that border from 1846 to 1948. That's over 100 years. The use of deadly force was always necessary on the Mexican border to preserve law and order, to stop smuggling, stop the kidnappings, the selling into white slavery, and so forth. That's nothing new. We had all the Army's cavalry regiments along those borders. We also had the Army's cavalry regiments on the border with Canada in many places, but the bulk was always along Mexico. Our focus at the Army War College in terms of hemispheric defense after World War I up until the mid-30s was Mexico. Mexico has always hosted our enemies, whoever they were, whether they were German or they were communists. The largest KGB operation in the Western Hemisphere was run out of Mexico City. The Mexicans were very sympathetic to the Soviets and communism, very anti-American. Now, when I say the Mexicans are anti-American, I'm not saying the average Mexican on the street hates Americans. That's not my point. The point is the government is not our friend, never has been. Today's government is an empty facade. Mexico is an organized crime state. Who are we kidding? And you don't want heavily armed troops on your border? Who do you think is pouring in? What are they bringing? At some point, an object lesson is going to be in order down there. That means that you're going to have to use deadly force. It's coming. I hope it happens before, we lose people unnecessarily because we're too weak.
Okay. I read just before getting on with you that House Republicans have summoned the mayor of Boston, Chicago, Denver, and New York City to testify under oath why they plan to block President Trump and this deportation operation. Do you think that's a good start? Does that get the American people's eyes on these leaders that are against this deportation operation?
Calling them leaders is probably a stretch. These mayors are full of racial hatred and animosity and antipathy for President Trump and people like you and me. That's what they trade on. That's what's gotten them into office. That's what keeps them in office. They're going to do everything they can to try and attack, undermine, and defame Americans that agree with the president and what he wants to do. But the truth of the matter is these people are universally unimpressive. When you listen to these people, unless you're very stupid, you will discover these people are unlettered. They don't know what they're doing. And they are speaking in infantile terms about things that they don't even understand. A lot of these people talk as though it's 1968 and they're fighting against the man. This is crazy. So I guess bringing them in to testify will do a good job of throwing their lack of qualifications and abilities into sharp relief. That could be good. But it's depressing. It's depressing that all the governments in these magnificent cities from San Francisco to New York City have fallen into the hands of these corrupt incompetents. But that's the way it is.
Okay. Let's switch gears. I don't know that Biden sending every last available dollar to Zelensky in Ukraine before leaving the Oval Office helped President Trump in his bid to end the Russia-Ukraine war. But with cutting off money and supplies to Ukraine, do you see this forcing Russia and Ukraine to peace negotiations? It seems that Putin is open to the idea, or at least encouraged by the idea of starting communication. Your thoughts on that?
First of all, President Putin and his government have always been open to negotiations, always been receptive to meet. It's not an issue. We are the ones that refuse to talk to them, that decline to negotiate on anything. So keep that in mind. Secondly, let's look at what's going on. You have President Trump who said, well, I can end this war in 24 hours. Okay. I guess he's given up on that. But he now seems to talk out of two sides of his mouth simultaneously. On the one hand, I love the Russian people and I want an end to this war. Okay. But if you don't sign up for my conditions, then I'm going to have tariffs and sanctions and anything else I can find to punish you, Vladimir Putin, for not meeting my demands for an end to this war. Does this sound bizarre? It makes no sense at all. Zelensky wouldn't exist except for us. We put him in power. We installed the government, and we fed this machine that he built and sent it into war against Russia. The goal of our proxy war was, quote unquote, to harm Russia. That's not a viable military task or mission. That makes no sense strategically, unless you are the sort of witless fool who thinks that if Russia suffers, we somehow or another profit. We don't. That's nonsense. So he's got to get rid of most of the people that are advising him on these matters as soon as possible. He's got to get out of the business of thinking that he has the power to impose a solution on the Russians or the Ukrainians. Now, if you want to get rid of Zelensky, by all means, do it. I'm 100% for it. He's our puppet. So if you really want this war to end, dump him. Now, who are you going to put in his place? I don't know. You have to ask the CIA and the other handlers behind the scenes who they want to stuff in as a puppet. But getting rid of Zelensky is a good step, and that should happen as soon as possible. He's a little Stalin. He has no respect for human rights or anybody's interests or opinions but his own. Now, then it comes to Russia. What are you going to tell the Russians? Are you going to tell them where to draw the line? Are you going to tell them how many forces they can have at this place or that place? The war is over. It's already been won by the Russians. They're simply running around the countryside cleaning up pockets of resistance. Now, it should be pretty obvious right now that the Russians do not want to march west. If they were really intent on marching west, they'd have done that a long time ago. They don't want to do it. They want to come to some sort of arrangement that guarantees Ukraine's neutrality for as long as we exist. Ukraine will be neutral. It will not be a platform for exploitation by us or anybody else to attack Russia. Simple. That's a valid security interest that we should respect. It would be like saying Mexico may never ally itself formally with Russia or China under any circumstances. If it does, and Russian and Chinese troops show up in Mexico, we reserve the right to attack Mexico. Does that sound unreasonable? No. So my point is, instead of dictating to the Russians who've already won this military engagement and telling them how it's going to be, you've really got to sit down and listen to them. And then you have to ask yourself, what do we, Stephen, what do we want from Russia? Do we want them to march into the streets, get on their knees, and commit mass suicide? Is that the goal? What the hell do we want from Russia? I think we want two things. Number one, peace. That's what Putin wants. He wants peace. We want peace. When he says it, he means it. When we say it, I don't believe anybody right now because I don't see any evidence that anybody's really interested in peace anywhere in Washington, D.C. So we need to make that clear. Number one is peace. Number two is cooperation. We and the Russians should cooperate. Now, what does that mean? We should cooperate in the development and the creation of a security architecture that can put an end to any further conflicts in Europe. I mean, one of the reasons that NATO came into existence and remained in existence for as long as it did was that we and the Europeans could agree that war was something that should not occur again in Europe. Reasonable? Sure. Okay, so let's structure this thing to avoid a future war. That means we tell them when and where we're going to do something militarily, at sea, in the air, on the ground. They tell us. All of this defined within boundaries on maps and how we're going to behave. You set up observers on both sides. Frankly, if we were serious, I would have an office in the Pentagon where there would be Russian liaison officers who were there to talk directly to us. The same thing with the Chinese, in terms of military matters. If something is happening and you want an answer, instead of going on the news and saying, there are those evil Chinese stirring up trouble, you walk down the hall and ask General whoever he is, what's happening right now off the coast of Hunan in the South China Sea? Please tell us. We don't understand. People see this as threatening. Can you help us? But that presupposes that we want peace. In other words, that we're interested in cooperation. That's cooperation. There are a lot of other areas where you can cooperate. No one is talking about peace and cooperation. All we hear is the Russians must be punished. They must not be rewarded for their success. Punished for what? Defending their country? Because by doing what they've done, they've defended Russia. Just as when we entered Mexico in 1916, 1917, after Pancho Villa's 2,000 men attacked us over the border in Arizona, we put 100,000 National Guardsmen on the border. This is stretching from California and the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. 100,000 National Guardsmen. And we took between 25 and 30,000 regular Army troops, much of it cavalry and artillery, into Mexico. And the objective, everybody said, well, it was to capture Pancho Villa. Truthfully, it was to drive the chaos in Mexico south, away from the American border. Now, that's what we did. You have to go back and look and see how many battles we fought, how many people were killed. But the point is, that's effectively the way Russia has handled this thing. They're not interested in invading Western Europe, and I don't see any evidence that the Mexicans were interested in invading the United States in 1916, 1917. It was all an effort to restore stability and push the threat away. Why can't we sit down and talk to people? Because we refuse to accept them as equals. With this pretentious moral nonsense. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said something along the lines of, whenever vice pays tribute to virtue, you have hypocrisy. And that's being reconstrued by Reinhold Niebuhr and a number of other learned people, that hypocrisy is the condition that exists when vice pays tribute to virtue. Well, we pay tribute to virtue, but we don't embody it and we don't adopt it. We're hypocrites of the worst kind. That needs to stop. We're living in a giant glass house. Everybody knows the truth. Let's stop pretending and let's find workable solutions, because ultimately that's what we need on this planet right now. We don't need a war of any kind that could ultimately escalate to the nuclear level. That should be uppermost in everybody's minds.
Okay. One part of Trump's communication that stood out to me, paying, what did you say to paying something to virtue?
When vice pays tribute to virtue is hypocrisy.
One area where I felt not vice, but just paying tribute to virtue was President Trump saying, acknowledging how many people Russia lost to help win World War II. Do you feel like that was him at least indicating to Putin, we see you, we see your past contributions?
Perhaps. His numbers are all wrong. He's never gotten any of them right. And truthfully, I don't think we'll ever know how many people died in the East during World War II. That war was so horrific and so damaging. It's a waste of time connecting it to what happens today. The important thing is to understand what's happening now. Over the last 3 years, we've seen probably 1.1 to 1.2 million Ukrainians die on the battlefield against the Russians. In that same time frame, the Russians have lost somewhere between 90 and 100,000 dead. Now, keep in mind that we in Vietnam, in the 8 years that we were on the ground there, lost 58,000 plus killed, over 100,000 wounded. This has been a much more intense conflict because we have poured everything we could into these Ukrainians in the hopes that they would do enormous damage to Russia. But having done that, the Russians recovered when they realized what they were up against, changed their strategy, reorganized their force, and went into battle, and they've won this war. That sacrifice is enormous, 90 to 100,000 Russians. If you stop and consider that sacrifice, the assumption that they are now going to meekly say, oh, thank you so much, we're going to withdraw from half the territory we currently control so that we can get along with you. That's absurd. That makes no sense. And the Ukrainians have to face up to the fact that they've lost. And I'm talking about the Ukrainians that are in charge. Sometimes I have trouble believing they're Ukrainians because I can't imagine any Ukrainian with a shred of decency and humanitarian impulse in him sending these people into battle over and over and over again to be slaughtered by a military machine they do not understand and cannot match.
I'm reading that the Trump administration wants to see an audit of the $200 billion in money and weapons that have gone to Ukraine. Do you think we will see an actual audit?
Well, have we been able to audit the Department of Defense? Answer is no. And some people laugh that off and say, well, you have to understand how large it is and how complex. Look, I'd like to see audits for a lot of things so that we understand where the money went. But there are a lot of people in Washington who are devoted to ensuring you and I never know that. So I don't know how you get past it at this point. President Trump fired the inspector generals. Everybody's up in arms. Well, where's the evidence that those people have done their jobs very well? We can't audit anything. And a big part of that is you have IGs on the ground. They call attention to things that are wrong, but then it's up to the Congress and the presidents to take action, and they haven't. So firing them is probably a great idea. See if you can find some honest men. How long will they be honest? I mean, there's this wonderful film called Boiler Room. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's about the stock market in New York City. And this is about a stock firm that is a sort of a Bernie Madoff operation. The whole thing is a lie and a scandal and a scam. And this new member of the stock exchange walks up and says, well, who's that up there? He said, well, that's the guy from the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he said, well, don't we have to run this by him? He said, oh, forget him. He's an idiot. We feed him whatever we want. He's meaningless. Ignore him. Okay. I think that's where we've been for a long time. So corruption has eaten our lunch, certainly in New York City and Washington, and probably everywhere else there's any significant concentration of wealth. So it's not going to be easy, but we're at a point in our history where we've got to take action because we're headed over a cliff. And you and I have talked about this cliff before. It's the financial economic cliff. You know, what are we paying now to service our national sovereign debt? Over $1 trillion. Oh, that's not a problem. Don't worry about it. What has President Trump said? I can suppress those interest rates. I can keep prices down. I can control the price of oil and natural gas. I can do all these things. No, he can't. The Fed is not even in control anymore. Prices continue to rise on the 10-year bonds, even though the Treasury Secretary and the Fed Chairman, our friend Powell, and he's a very good man, by the way, very intelligent. I don't blame everything on him by any means. But he can't fix it. He's trying to drive down interest rates. And at the same time, the interest rates on the 10-year bonds keep going up. And the bonds that are already out there, 45% of them in China alone, have all been dumped because they're worthless. They all came out when it was practically zero interest rate. And we have these bonds all over the world. The longer this goes on and we take no action to deal with it, more bonds will be sold, more bonds will be dumped, and eventually we'll be in a death spiral. You don't need to listen to me. You can pick it up and listen to what Ray Dalio has to say. You know, you can talk to any number of people out there. Michael Pharma is another one that's very good. You know, listen to what they have to say. We're in a very serious condition right now. What the president, in addition to dealing with the border, should do is look at how we can make massive cuts in spending. And of course, that's like a funeral march in Washington, D.C. If they can't appropriate money, what are they there for? That's their big income earning opportunity. That's where they earn all the votes. We exist to spend money. That's why we are here. That's what they'll tell you. And that's why they've all got to go. And at this point, the president ought to be looking at where are we going to cut? Because at some point you have to show your creditors, here's my plan. I know I'm in deep trouble. I can't pay everything I owe you right now, but I can do these things. And I think if I do these things, we can sustain ourselves. Any evidence that he or anybody else in Washington is willing to do that with our creditors?
Doesn't get them elected.
So I think we're headed over and down over the cliff. Now, once you're in the abyss at the bottom of the cliff, how much help are you going to get? Not much. There'll be hard times. Credit dries up. Everything goes to shit, frankly. Pardon my language.
Yeah. Well, you know, many that watch this show, we lived through the Great Recession and, you know, the dot-com bubble, and it's ugly, 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 ugly. Colonel Macgregor, I know you have a hard out to head out. I appreciate you coming on today and sharing this information. If people want to follow you online, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I think just go to ourcountry.ourchoice.com. I'm the CEO there. We're continuing to build membership. We published a 5-point plan, which I urge people to go online and go to the website and look at the plan, what it talks about. There's many of the same issues you and I are discussing here. And more people are joining us because they recognize it doesn't make any difference who you vote for. You get the same bad outcome. Just imagine how millions of Americans felt when this man Waltz, the national security advisor, walked out of a meeting with Jake Sullivan and said, "You'll all be happy to know there's not a shade of difference between me and Mr. Sullivan. We are both on the same sheet of music. We are going to sustain these policies." Really? That's why we voted for President Trump? Come on. So we may be stupid some of the time, but we're not all stupid all the time. These politicians don't get it.
Yeah. A lot to clean up in the DC swamp. Well, thank you again, sir, for coming on. I'll put a direct link to that down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Hey, same to you, Stephen. Bye-bye.